Kia ora koutou and welcome to our Farm Focus Day for the 18th of March 2020. It's great to have you all here via a live stream event. This is the first time I've been involved with one of these with the team here today, so we're looking forward to having your questions along the way that will help keep this interactive. Just wanted to quickly highlight to you the partners that are involved in this special project here at our farm. Our farm is a joint venture between St Peter's and Lincoln University, and of course we have LIC, PGG Rights and Seeds, DNZ Balance, Farm Source and Westpac, who are our valued partners in this project. Now, I just wanted to highlight to you that today we are going to be talking about quite a bit of information that has been presented in the handout. Now, if you haven't got access to the handout, it can be found on the Our Farm website, www.ourfarm.nz, where you can download it. It's about 47 pages, but there's lots of graphs and information that is in that handout that we will be talking to today. So jump on there and make sure you've got access to that handout as well. We are planning to have a 1-hour presentation. The idea is that we'll have about 20 minutes of a seasonal update, which Tom will take us through. We'll have a quick update on the budget and how our financial position is tracking and how we're looking to finish up at the end of the year. And then we've got Jair and Bill who will help us out with the mating review. So we'll follow that up with a plan for the autumn. So a lot of you have been asking us about what our strategy has been to date and what it will be moving forward. And then at 11:30 we're going to open up for a bit of a general Q&A. So if there's been questions that have come throughout the day that we haven't been able to address through each of those topics, we'll have some time allocated right at the end. So the way we're going to function, we've got some of our valued team members that are here with us today, and they'll pop up and do their presentation as we go, but I just thought I would introduce, we've got Jair Mandrazia, who's the repro advisor for LIC, and he's been working very closely with us to analyse our reproductive performance. And we've also got Bill Hancock from Cambridge Vets, who is one of our valued experts when it comes to animal health and animal management within our farm. So really pleased to be able to have you here, and also Tom Buckley is here as our farm manager. So just to set the scene a little bit, well, it was really cool. Tom and I always engage in a lot of personal development, and we were off at the Farmers Forum in February, and one of the PowerPoints that went up was this one that is now on the slide there. Capitalism has been disrupted as the free market is questioned. And both Cameron Bagri and Bruce Thorold talked about this concept of how we are moving from a shareholder capitalism model to a stakeholder capitalism. And to me, that was really brilliant to see that being talked about, because it epitomises the concept of what we're trying to do with the wagon wheel and the scorecard approach at our farm. So the idea for us, and every decision we're making on farm puts in the middle of that decision the outcome for the staff, customers, environment, communities, and delivering on our social licence to operate. And we want to genuinely create long-term value with the way that we operate our farm business. So it was really cool to see that talked about in the wider industry. And that can be seen in our scorecard or wagon wheel approach about how we're trying to push the frontier out in all aspects, not just on any one area, but every decision we make has to incorporate the impacts on our people, our animals, our wider environment, and our greater community. So we'll kind of refer to that a little bit as we go through the decision-making process. Now, you'll all be pretty familiar with this. This was the farm. This was late December actually, so we had a little bit of rain. I think the last bit of rain was probably about 22nd of December, and she was still looking pretty dry there. Those little spots of black there are the cows in one of our crop paddocks. So you can see at that point we had already started to have quite a little bit of leaf dry off. Not a really dark green look there, but quite light there. And then as we continued through, this was our wetland area. So those of you who have seen the wetland area, those weirs hold about 1/2 metre of water before the water runs through to the next pond. This was it all dried out. And I mean, it's given us the opportunity to replant, which is great, but it just shows you the extent of lack of water that's actually been flowing through the farm. And this is pretty much the end of last month, end of February, what we were able to feed the cows. So pre-graze is there on your right and the residual is on your left, so not a lot of feed around. So Tom's going to talk a little bit about the season to date and give us a bit of an update on some of the physical stuff, physical KPIs.
Thanks, Joe. Despite the struggles over the past few months, milk production has held us surprisingly well. Only 2% behind on production compared to last year, and we all know last year was a tough season. We've eaten most of the surplus feed that was made into silage during the spring, and all of the silage that was carried over from last season. We actually brought in another additional 40 tonne of silage in December, which sort of used up some of the budget that we had set aside to make homegrown silage in anticipation of a dry summer. As of the 14th of March, we'd produced 156,000 solids. It's about 93% of last year's total milk production. While we won't achieve our 2019-2020 target of 178,000, we must take some, or have some perspective of how much money we spend on that last 6 to 8%, without compromising body condition score and average pasture cover for the next season. Remaining cows that are in milk are still producing 1.2, which is pleasing, with an average body condition score of 4.3 for the mature cows, 4.4 for the heifers. Unfortunately, milk solids, as I said, from homegrown feed is not as good as back in November due to the lack of pasture growth and also the crop growth. Over the past 3 months, we've grown just over 200 tonne less feed on farm, which is quite substantial. We have used feed we will not use feed that we intend to need during the spring, as this is important to help us budget through the winter period. Since we've been going through this tough time, we've actually brought in 150 bales, which we've averaged about 22 tonne of dry matter for late summer, early autumn production. We've diluted our palm kernel contract with 12 tonne of tapioca. This has helped with our FEI management through the summer. As you'll all have noticed, summer's been extremely long and hot and dry, with only 38 mils of rain received since the 23rd of December. This has proven challenging for pasture and crop growth, and we have managed by spreading our feed usage at low rates across a variety of sources, which has kept the diet very stable for the past few months, resulting in a steady milk production. We've also been able to use different milking regimes over the past few months to manage our body condition score, with 3 and 2 milking being used through January and early February, and then swapping to full once-a-day milking in February and currently. This has led to more stable BCS across the whole herd. I've been really surprised with how content the cows have been over the last few months, considering how tough the conditions have been. Taking stock of feed inventory each week with Joe on our weekly farm walk has meant that we have been able to tweak our weekly plan without making any big changes, which has left the cows even more settled. Culling cows where possible has been a challenge, but we've only got 15 left, which is good. Hopefully they'll be gone next week. We've dried off the low body condition scores, and on Friday we dried off a further 104, so that leaves that is 156 cows dried off so far. Not all of these mid-calving cows, which were dried off last week, needed drying off, but it has helped to reduce the feed demand. Feed demand that is left for us to feed the cows over the next few weeks. It is necessary that these have been dried off sooner, as I just said, to reduce that demand on our silage, but also the palm kernel and average pasture cover is under a bit of stress at the moment without any further follow-up rain. The farm's in a really good growing state since that 30 mils at the end of February, but we really need another follow-up rain. tomorrow we will start using our bales, and it's 6 bales a day to feed 6 kilos for our milkers. It's going to be short going to before we run out of those bales. We've used slightly less or slightly more in to produce a similar amount of milk off less feed. Complicated, I know, but I put this down to better management of our feed through the spring. We were able to keep average pasture cover closer to 2050 to 2150 pre-Christmas. However, it is now the lowest I've seen it in the 5 years I've been here. Since the 30 mils of rain, we've pushed out to 65 to 70 day round. This will give all the paddocks the best chance possible when follow-up rain does arrive. Monitoring growth rates, round speed and targeting takes have been the focus over the past few months. Taking stock each week has been really important. Over the last few months, we've grown 2 tonne less of pasture and crops. As I said earlier, this is a 200 tonne deficit. So we've had to buy in some of that feed to fill the gap and reduce our demand. I think that's about all I have to say. But thank you for listening.
Steady, Tom. So we've got some questions from the group about how did the crop strategy come into play with the reduced growth rates that you can now see on the PowerPoint there, Tom?
So as we were going into January, so end of December, the crops were really starting to dry out with that hot, dry wind that we received. So rather than wait another week, we made a start transitioning the cows in around the 28th, 29th of December. So we made a start on them early. By the end of January, we were ripping through them at 5 kilos a day per cow. So we pulled that back. We took stock of what other feed we had on hand, and we managed to stretch it out for the same time period that was budgeted, just at a lower rate per cow.
Great. And there was another question about the low pasture cover. So hitting 1600 is pretty precarious, isn't it? The target is to keep it above 1800. How did you manage individual grazings and prevent damage from overgrazing, particularly when it got really dry, Tom?
So, even I was surprised how content the cows were. As I said before, there's far more feed out there than you think. You look back into the spring and you're looking at all this long green grass. The cows will find something to eat in that paddock. Once they'd finished that feed, we actually took them off those grazing paddocks and we targeted future crop paddocks just to get a bit of nutrient deposit in there. So we were spending our nights in those future crop paddocks and feeding the silage and palm kennel in there.
Okay, and we had another question, Tom, about the milking frequency. So you've played with a little bit of, there was twice a day, there was 3 and 2, and then once a day. What do you think the impact has been on individual cow performance? And then how did your team actually manage that, trying to feed crops at the same time as well?
First challenge was getting my head around the 3 and 2 and how I was going to fit break feeding crops and feeding multiple loads of silage. So it took me about 10 days to make a plan, and everything was moving as I was making that plan. So the cows and the staff and I really enjoyed the 3 and 2. We didn't seem to be milking in any hot period of the day. Possibly the afternoon walks from the crop paddock down the bottom. They were a bit warm, but by the time we started milking and we were under the sprinklers, things were quite cool. So starting on 3 and 2 was sort of 1.6, I think, there early January, and then transitioning each transition onto a new regime, we dropped 1.1 to 0.2. But the cows have really lasted really well considering the hard times we've been through.
And just recently, with the last lot of dry off, you pretty much dried off a third of the herd and only had a quarter of a drop in production. Can you explain a little bit about what might be happening there?
I think the cows that are left in milk, they may be taking a little bit off their back, but they're also supported with the greenest grass on the farm. The post yesterday of the cows grazing, that was our best cocksfoot paddock, but there's a lot of green grass out there, so there's some really good quality going into these cows. It's not just brown feed. that's where we really got our fingers crossed to get some more follow-up rain so we can keep grass growing.
The somatic cell count, so with variable milkings and having to dry cows off, one of the big threats to a lot of farmers will be managing somatic cell count within the threshold. Can you tell us a little bit about the lead up to when you changed milking frequency? How did you manage somatic cell counts, and then how you're dealing with cows at the moment to ensure that you're not going over the threshold as you're drying cows off and having less literage going into the vat?
Obviously, just trying to feed them as well as we can. We've had a targeted approach on high cell count cows through last year's dry off and culling regime last year. We're hitting them a little bit harder this year. With the transition between milking regimes, we've had a Monday-Friday strip regime on stripping the cows out, just to pick up any mastitis as early as possible. But yeah, trying to keep the cows well fed through those transitions has been a real key. We've got a couple of culls ready to go that are high cell count, so we've actually pulled them out of the herd, so we're reducing any spread that they may be causing.
And then this last graph here, Tom, which shows our FEI. You've talked a little bit about using variable products mixed with the palm kernel to dilute it. Can you tell us a little bit about how you actually managed the intakes and how you managed making sure you weren't going over the threshold in a bit more detail?
It's certainly been a challenge, as you can see, with the ups and downs there on the FEI, and that's only varying sort of half a kilo over the last sort of 6 weeks. In January, when we got up to the C, we actually pulled it out for 5 days and replaced it with extra silage. Talking to the nutritionist, Charlotte Westwood, who's on our committee, she said building that the correct bugs up in the gut of the cow early on while you transition onto turnips, in conjunction with having pumpkin in the diet, can be a bit troublesome. So I think next year when we start on the turnips, we won't have PK in the diet until they're fully transitioned, and that should smooth out that graph a little bit better. But every year is a challenge. All the different feeds that we've been feeding, they're always going to be different every year. With that last drop, we're actually probably the higher end of palm kernel feeding for the whole season, but we've now changed on to our bought-in bales. So we're just waiting for the last load of bales to arrive, and then we'll send a sample of each lot to Hills to actually have them analysed. But that may be causing a bit of a drop there as well.
Tom, we've got a question from Greg who asks, you guys fed a lot of silage throughout the season. Is this all made on farm, or do you have a runoff? Do you want to explain a little bit about sort of how much silage we made on farm, how much we had to bring in just to get the bunkers full, and then where else we might be sourcing feed from?
So obviously spring was great, not a lot of damage just due to how dry it was. Growths never really got going like they did last year, or 2018 spring. So we knew we were going to be a bit short heading into summer. So we made the decision, there's a block across the road from us where we could get 40 tonne of silage from. So we bought that in because we didn't make as much silage going through spring. Luckily, we made a lot more silage last year, so we're actually able to carry about 70-80 tonne through from last season. As I said before, we've actually eaten all of that as well, so we're lucky that we actually had it on hand. We've managed to source some bales from various contractors around the region. Some grass silage bales from the Hautipu Dairy Factory through Langsford's, and some bales from Finch's as well. But no, the answer is we don't have a runoff. We just try and grow it all on farm if we possibly can.
Cool. Thanks, Tom. People are a really important part of the system, and I think we have to take our hats off to the work that the team have done this summer. It's been a really hard summer. Lani, Malu and Tom have worked really hard to be disciplined with feed allocation, monitoring information. There's been a lot of work just getting all the feed out to the cows all the time, managing somatic sow count, animal health, all that sort of stuff takes a lot of time and dedication. So we're very conscious that we don't want our system to overload the people that are really important in it. And one of the things that we are monitoring are the average hours per week. At our farm, we have a goal of reaching 45 average hours per person per week. And on the PowerPoint there, you'll see how we're tracking on each of the months. Now, we've moved down from our peak numbers around September, October of around 60 hours per person down to about 44 to 49 throughout this period. It's of note, excuse me, of note, during this time, it was probably early February that Marlu has left. So she'd left to be with her partner, find work with her partner. And so Lani and Tom have been doing most of the work on farm during this dry period. So the key thing probably when we look at the average hours per week is what sort of things did you maybe not do on farm, Tom, during the time when you were spending more time looking for water leaks, ensuring access to water, getting feed out to cows, shifting crop fences and things like that? Were there things that got put on the to do next time list?
Not really. We've spent a lot of time feeding out. Certainly from previous jobs, I've learnt through the quieter times, just try and do one job a day. So we've had a big clean up of fallen branches and limbing up trees so that over the winter period we're not getting branches falling on fences while we're busy and we don't have the time to sort those out. So just spreading that task over time, but also managing our effluent. We've got a nice big pond that we built 2 winters ago. We're able to fill it up and empty it over time, and while we're busy feeding out or doing the crop fences, we weren't having to do the effluent. So. But I think a key thing through the whole year is having your staff all trained to be able to do every job on the farm. They don't have to be making all the decisions, but just have an understanding of why they're doing a task. Takes a lot of pressure off, the management team. But it's great for their learning as well. Lani and Malou both studying their level 3 and level 4 ITO, so they're off farm once a fortnight studying, and that really brings back some off farm learning. They can talk to their friends on how things are done on their farm, and I'm always asking their opinion on how we do things. Have they got any suggestions on how we do things better? So.
Cool, thanks, Tom. And the other thing of note too is that we wanted to be certain we could maintain our 12 and 2 roster during this period with only 2 people on farm, and also ensure that there was time for personal development and chance to get off farm. So the use of relief milkers we've used for the last sort of 4 to 6 weeks since Marlu left, because we wanted to make sure the work that the rest of the team was doing was going to be sustainable. One of the other things that we probably need to be aware of, and we are considering as we move forward, is we will recruit again for another farm assistant on the farm, due to start before the end of the season, so we've got time for them to get up to speed. We are aware that on the 1st of April the minimum wage goes up to $18.90, so for somebody who's going to be on, say, a $49,000 salary, that's a 100-hour fortnight on a 12 and 2 roster. And if you look through our numbers, you can see that during the peak period, the team is averaging about 60, 63. So we're going to be looking through the information that we collected with the job analysis work, just to see how do we incorporate sustainable work hours for somebody who might be on a farm assistant role and not put undue pressure on the rest of the team. So we have to think smarter about what we do, whether it's use of technology or smoother processes, or there might be some things that we're doing that we don't need to be doing. So we'll be looking through all that just to make sure that we've got sustainable, rewarding work hours for the team that we've got on board again next season. Cool. Okay. Sorry, just checking the questions out. So what we're going to do, thank you, Tom. We just want to kind of summarise the financial implications of the season that's been, that Tom has talked about. There's a couple of key points that I just wanted to highlight. When we did our budget, we were budgeting between a window of I think it was 6.25 to 7.25. So we set the budget up at $6.75 and we were aiming to do 177,000 kilos, as Tom mentioned. That was based on a pretty good autumn production. So to the end of February, we were pretty much on track with last season's production, but there's no way we're going to hit 177 by the end of this season. So I just wanted to talk through with you a couple of the variances that we've seen in our cash flow to date. Now this is up to the end of January, but I can estimate sort of how we're going to roll out as we get closer to the end of the year. So a couple of key points that I wanted to highlight, some variances. Firstly, the increased payout. So if we, based on the budget versus what we're actually going to do, if we achieve 160,000 by the end of this month, we will be about 26 grand less income. If we hit 164,000, which means it has to rain in the next sort of week to 10 days, and we can keep that main milking mob through to the end of April, we should hit about 164,000 kilos. That means our milk income is going to be about the same as what we had originally budgeted, which was 177,000 kilos of milk solids at a $6.75 payout. So that's the influence on the increased payout and as it filters through into our budget. Reduced stock income. Tom already talked about how hard it's been to get the cows off farm, but it's also been at a reduced income, about $200 or so per cow reduced. So for us, that's about 8 to 10 grand of reduced income that we'll see come through this year for stock. We have had an increased spend on supplements. So up to the end of February, we were pretty much on track. I think end of January, we've spent about $63,000. For the next 4 months, so February through till end of May, we'll spend about another $60,000 to $63,000 on supplements. So that's the extra silage that Tom talked about, and about 150 tonne of palm kernel. So that will get our final expenditure up to about $120,000. The budget is about $110,000. So at this stage, we're only looking at an overspend in the supplements of about 10 grand. And the reason why this isn't as significant as you would expect is because we were able to manage spring grown feed on farm really well early on, and we were able to push feed forward into that summer dry period. There is quite a big underspend that comes through in the cash flow for fertiliser. That has now been used. It's delayed phosphate fertiliser that has now been applied now, so we expect that that will all be used up by the time we finish our year. And there was an underspend on homemade silage. So that 14 grand, some of it we used to buy extra feed from the property next door and to put into our pit. So we weren't able to make as much silage as we would like to, hence we made the decision quite early on in the season to fill up the bunkers and use that money that was allocated to make silage to actually purchase in some more silage. And at the moment, we're tracking pretty well. So you can see that for the variances, once you total up the variances, we're actually over and above where we should be. If we look at how this will pan out for the rest of the year, the budget is that we'll have about a $213,000 surplus for the year. We predict that if we dry off at the end of this month with 160,000 kilos, the surplus will be about $166,000. If we get rain and we're able to continue milking through with the feed that we have planned to have purchased or have allocated funds for, if we can do the 164,000, the surplus is about 192. So for us, we're looking at about sort of anywhere between 21k and 47k less profit for this season. There's a couple of other things in the budget that you'll notice are quite big overspends. The R&M, we've invested quite a lot in races. That was due to some challenges that we had with lameness earlier on in the year and some delayed capital work. And so we think that R&M overspend will continue right through to the end of that budget. So we don't really predict any other areas in which we'll be underspending. Any questions there on the... Okay, so if you've got any questions about the budget stuff, write it through on YouTube and we'll try and make sure that we can address it. Right, so mating review. So quite a few of you were keen to find out how our mating went this year. So we've got Jaya Mandraza from LIC, the repro specialist, and he's going to talk a little bit about the analysis of our results, and then him and Tom are going to have a bit of a talk about what are the practical implications for our farm. Thanks, Jaya.
Thank you. Awesome. Well, firstly, good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to be here reviewing, I guess, the mating performance of our farm. I will get you guys to, if you have access to the handout, flick it up to page 19, and we can, I guess, you can have a look if the image is not as clear perhaps as we would like it to be. So firstly, one of the objectives that our farm had was to implement a different mating strategy. Of interest is using liquid sex semen, and also trying to I guess minimise the amount of bobby calves that they produce as well, and add value to the business, I guess, perhaps through different incomes, through the Wagyu program, and also the use of SGL Hereford semen. So one of the challenges that was thrown there was try to maintain the reproductive performance accepting that in general sex semen, liquid sex semen has an average 3% lower conception rates than the conventional liquid semen. But what we found here is that yes, the answer was we were able to maintain reproductive performance. The 6-week in-calf rate, as you can see in the graph there, was 74% the year before, the same performance this year, despite that change. And the not-in-calf rate improved a little bit by 3%, and a lot of it was due to a slightly longer mating period. If you look at the graph that you're seeing in the slide, you see that the lighter blue line refers to the 2018 mating season and finishes a little bit earlier than the darker blue line, and at the time that the light blue line finishes, the not-in-calf rates, or the amount of cows pregnant, is very, very similar. But that was very, very successful. So one of the things that was important and different was there was a lot less intervention. This blip that you see in the graph and the lighter blue line that it kind of is a steeper rate of cows getting pregnant is the use of Y-weight. So that was not used this year. We did use still a similar amount of seeders to achieve this reproductive performance, intervene in some cows, but not as much, trying to perhaps obtain a performance that relies less on intervention, I guess, through drugs. So hormonal intervention should be the word. But anyway, the key here, I guess, is we highlighted also in the handout, is that what that means is that we're going to get a slightly, I guess, a lower rate of cows calving earlier, so there is a little bit of an impact there on days of milk, or for the farm, and we estimate it to be based on what we are expecting the cows to calve on in 2020 to be about around 1,000 days of milk for the farm. So this is something we're going to have to monitor and see how it actually translates, because there's a difference between what is expected when cows are expected to calve and when they actually calve. So we'll keep an eye out and keep you informed on what that actually means. There is a little bit of loss of income there through milk, but we're expecting that the added value from the beef product that was used on the farm will offset that, and we'll wait until the cows actually calve, so we have an understanding of how many calves actually come through and how many survive, and the costs involved with having those animals stay on farm a little bit longer. Other than that, there was also a difference perhaps in the cost of the breeding program when we compare the cost of what was done in 2018 to 2019. There's definitely an increase. Well, there is an increase there. It's around 6,000 K. That a lot of it is due to the sex semen straws that were used, but it's something, again, along with the perhaps what we would say is a lost days of milk, a slightly more expensive mating breeding program. We'll have to have a very good look at it come calving time to see what the benefits of using the beef product to offset those costs will be. From a performance point of view, I guess the challenge was to try and offset what we expect to be a slightly lower conception rate from liquid sex semen in front of you, and it's also in your handouts on page 21. You will have the different conception rates achieved by the different products that we use here. Of most interest really is the difference between, or how similar the performance is between the conventional semen, which is also a liquid product, and the liquid sex semen. And for that, I'll actually bring Tom in to join me so he can tell us a little bit more about how he went about to select the cows that he would use sex semen on. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
In theory, this was easy. So every year when I get my wool chart, I'll select the best cows. So we didn't want to mate our bottom 20%. So they were selected to either go to short gestation, dairy, wagyu or Hereford. So they were coloured in a different colour. So each day when we were pulling cows, I select the best 10. We were given 10 straws a day, so it was the best 10 each day, really, to make it simple.
Cool, nice. And I guess the good thing about that is a simple enough process, and what it did was it maximised, I guess, the output from the product, which was the liquid sex semen. And out of that, you've achieved a pretty good conception rate. So thanks, Don. That's awesome. Another point to make that I want to make, and is something that I hear very often, is that people tend to use SGL dairy product towards the end of the mating season, and they may observe lower conception rates, which if you look at this table that you're seeing on your screen, it is true. However, I think what is important to remember is that the fact that you use whatever semen it is towards the later part of mating will cause lower conception rates regardless of what it is. So the fact that we use SGL dairy products later means that we are at a very different place, I guess, from an environment point of view, be it feeding, availability, quality, heat, the amount of heat detection, or I guess the activity that there is around, and also, just cows that have been mated perhaps once or twice before and are being exposed to this product. So it's important to bear that in mind, and when we look at the national data, we see that the better weeks to get cows pregnant really are the first 4 or 5. That's when conception rates are at their highest, and then as weeks go on over time, the conception rates drop, and by the time we get to about week 11 of mating, it's not the average is around 33-35% for conception rates. So it's not an unexpected result. And if you have a look a little bit later on, and in the handout, a couple of pages forward, you'll see the Fertility Focus report. And when you look at the Fertility Focus report of our farm, you see that the only place that has a 1-star, there's conception rate, which is something we discussed a fair bit when we talked about this. And one of the factors that comes into that is that because you're doing all AB, as a rule, you're dabbing into a time that is harder, or the conception rates are lower, therefore you're kind of diluting your performance a little bit. So there is a little bit of that to be taken into account as well. So something for you to bear in mind. When it comes down to, I guess, what we're going to do going forward, what are the things that we will learn from this season? One of the big things that we're looking at as objectives is try to achieve a tighter body condition score distribution. I guess that the key here is, if you look at that graph, and also on your page 21 of your handout, you'll see that in July, if we look down at the table in this slide, you see that 2-year-olds had an average body condition score of 5.9. The 3-year-olds had an average 5.5. But it's the idea or the ideal, the target is to have cows, 3-year-olds at an average 5.5 and no more than 15% of them being above or below target, and that is perhaps the bit that is not as tight. And also something we did talk a little bit about in terms of the mixed age cows is that they were at a body condition score of 5.6 by the time mating calving came, and we did discuss whether we need to be a bit careful not to have too many cows that are above target. By the time we have an average of 5.5 means that we have some cows that are off target 5 that are at 6, and therefore we might be starting to dabble a little bit into issues with ketosis instead of lack of body condition score. So that's something that the dry-off plan and the feeding plan will be addressing as well this coming season. Of note, Tom did mention how he was working really hard to ensure attack the high somatic cell counts, and from a reproductive performance point of view, you can see that animals that were recorded as having mastitis, this table is also on page 22 of your handout. The second line there is the mastitis cows, and they're the ones that have the lowest 6-week in calf rate. So compared to any other animal that had anything recorded against them. So for us, also one of the things we talked about was that this coming season we will try and minimise the amount of mastitis, because animals that get affected by it, and in our farm's case, end up having a slightly lower reproductive performance too. And that's it's 8% of the herd. So by the time you have a group of cows, 8% of them that have a lower reproductive performance, it will hold their overall reproductive performance down as well back. So the next part that we wanted to just double check, just to share with you, is around the effect of the genetics and also the production indexes into reproductive performance. So the first table that you have in there is talking about the breeding worth. The way we worked this out was we ranked the cows, all the cows in the herd, in this case in breeding worth, and we divided them in quartiles to try and understand whether breeding worth was an impacted reproductive performance. And from what we can see on the table there, you have the number of cows in each one of the quartiles, the 3-week submission rate, which is very, very similar for all the quartiles, but the 6-week in calf rate, there is a trend that the higher breeding worth animals ended up with a better 6-week in calf rate compared to the lower half, I guess, of the herd, and also a better nodding calf rate as well. So those animals that are more efficient, measured by breeding worth, achieved a higher reproductive performance in our farm case. The next graph we're going to look at is the same scenario, dividing, ranking our farm cows via fertility breeding value, which is something we've been talking a fair bit in the industry as of late. And we just wanted to understand what the impact is and if there is a big impact there. We can see that the top quartile fertility breeding value animals in the herd performed better. Same scenario, the table has the number of cows in each quartile, submission rate, 6-week in calf rate, and nodding calf rate. And the key there is that other than the top quartile being a bit higher, the other 3 quartiles are very similar in terms of reproductive performance. So what we are saying is that from a reproductive performance point of view, fertility breeding value is not necessarily something that is holding the reproductive performance of our farm back. When it comes down to production worth, so we're talking about production indexes here, and it's kind of trying to use this as a proxy for high producing cows, I guess. If you assume that high PW animals are also better producers or more efficient in terms of production, we're trying to touch into that side of things here. Same scenario, rank the herd from the highest PW to the lower PW, divided in quartiles, and we are reporting on it here. That table there will have the same scenario, submission rate, 6-week in calf rate, and nodding calf rate. And the main thing here is that the top half, so the two top quartiles, have a better 6-week in calf rate and a lower not in calf rate than the bottom quartiles. What we expect to see here is more that what I see in the national data is that the quartiles don't have a big difference in performance. So when animals are well managed, what you'll see is that production worth doesn't necessarily affect reproductive performance a lot. In the case of our farm, the top half of them, of the PW, were better than the bottom half, which is pleasing. From an LW, lactation worth point of view, so we're talking about this season production and measuring the animals and comparing them. Same scenario, rank them in LW and try to look at 6-week in calf rate and not in calf rate, and we see the same. The animals that had the highest LW, the top half anyway, had a better reproductive performance than the animals in the bottom half in terms of LW. So I guess the main message to take out of here is that if you have the opportunity to cull animals, LW and PW are two very good measures to make those decisions on, because it doesn't make much of a difference. In fact, it makes a positive difference if you can keep animals that have positive figures.
Thanks, Joe. We had a question from the audience about what's the future plan on availability of sex semen and how early in the season it can be available?
That's a very good question, and that's something I cannot answer right now. I know we are looking at ramping up sex semen. There are, I guess, 1-year targets and 5-year targets. It's not part of what I am directly involved, so I will hold back and maybe I'll get back to you with what the plan is, so then you can share with the audience as well. Okay.
Awesome.
Cool.
Thanks, Joe. Okay, and we're going to move on from the mating performance to look at the crops. We had quite a few questions from the group at our last focus day when we were looking at the crops about what was the economic value of them. So in your handout there's quite a lot of detail about how we have costed out the value of the crops, and I'm just going to kind of highlight how we've gone through that process and how the sensitivity tables work. So the crops in general, Tom kind of alluded to the fact that the crops were used from early January through to almost mid-March, and an 11-week feeding period at about 3 kilos a cow on just over 9 hectares gave us an average yield of about 10 tonne for the crops in general. So we can look at each of the crops and their pricings. We actually had yield measurements done on the crops right at the sort of end of December and just before they were being grown and a little bit later on, so we've got quite a lot of data about the crops. What we've done is we've factored into account the full cost of growing the crops, so all the sprays that were required, and then we've put them into a sensitivity table. So in your handout, on page... this for you. 26. Bear with me. Page 26 has got the full costings for both the kale and the turnip crops. So when we extrapolate out that cost over the potential yield, we come up with a sensitivity table for each of the different crops. So for example, if our average yield for the turnip crops was 10, which we're sort of working on, our cost just to establish that crop and grow it is about 15.9 or 16 cents. Now, we know that we lose the productive potential of that paddock from October all the way through till March when we put a summer crop in. So we use information from the Forage Value Index, which values pasture in October and November at about 17 cents and then through the summer period at 37 cents. Now, it's quite interesting what happens. On page 28 of your handout, you'll see we've created a sensitivity table of which includes the value of lost pasture or pasture forgone as well. So in a normal year, which we would normally grow, fairly well during that summer period or average, I guess, a 10-tonne crop with pasture forgone equates to about 34 cents. Now, what actually happened is that instead of growing about 8 tonne during that year, we grew about sort of 5 tonne. And so the pasture foregone component of that cost is a whole lot less. So the value of those crops, those 10-tonne crops to us, comes in at about 27 cents. So for us, when we were out on the open market trying to source feed, you couldn't get anything at 27 cents. And even if you could or had contracted in palm kernel at that rate, we were limited by the amount that we could actually feed. So the crops at that cost and how they fit into our system actually provided a really good value feed for us. And we're quite happy with that cost. We would love to have had high yields. Prior to grazing, the turnips were sitting a lot higher and we lost a lot of leaf mass as it dried out. But the kale crops actually seemed to hold on relatively well. I've just showed a screenshot there of the kale crops, one of them measured there at 9 tonnes. The picture of me standing in there at that end was about 15 tonnes. So we had quite a variety of yield across the paddocks, but we used about a 10 tonne average yield for the kale crops as well. So for the kale, it ended up about 28 cents. Based on the establishment costs of about $17.50 and the pasture foregone of about $1,000 there. So at 28 cents, that was still a relatively cheap in respect to the season that we've had. Feed that we were able to bring in, but it also had a lot of other benefits. Now, we were quite lucky yesterday. We caught up with Kyle Gardine and Charlotte Westwood from PGG Wrights and Seeds, and we actually got them to talk. We asked them a few questions about the crops, in particular about the relative yields of these crops in the Waikato compared to other things like chicory. Some of you have asked about chicory. And also we asked them about feed characteristics of the different crops, the protein and the starch-soluble sugars that they're able to provide, and then also how kale fits into the system. So those video interviews can be found on our YouTube channel that you're tuning into now. So catch up with those 3 videos if you have a special interest in the crops and you'd like to have those 3 questions answered. Now, I'm just going to ask Tom to come up and just talk a little bit about his observations in the practical management of the crops and his view about whether he would be keen to grow them again next year. We actually had a question from one of the viewers. Given the yields in the summer, what's the plan for next summer? Are you keen to grow the combination of the turnips and kale crops again?
Yeah, I don't think it was the crop's fault that they didn't perform very well. I think all crops have struggled this year because anything living requires water. The crops had a hard start with a few attacks of bugs, but they've remained really healthy up until that mid-December. The kale, definitely planning on doing that again. Kyle and I have definitely talked about selecting better paddocks, so a bit more suitable, that are going to hold on to a bit more moisture for a bit longer this coming season, and targeting sort of grass-to-grass regimes for improving pasture on the dry areas of the farm.
Thanks, Tom. Stay here. This is a tag team effort.
Cool.
Okay, so one of the last topics that we sort of want to talk to you a little bit about today was about surviving summer and getting back on track for autumn. So we've already alluded to the summer that we've had and a little bit about what our planned approach is. And we'd like to talk a little bit in more detail about the information that you'll find in your handout around what our approach is to surviving the rest of the autumn. Now, some of you may be aware that the process that we use is we put towards our management team a plan or an approach, and then we gain agreement on what the strategy will be, and then we monitor that weekly. So we put our first dry summer plan together for review and to hear from our experts at the end of January. Once we knew we weren't on track to achieve what we needed to, and we were going through our feed resources quite quickly. Since then, we put together another plan at the end of February because we only had 2 weeks of crop left and we needed to make some pretty big decisions. And we are just in the process now of building our 3rd version of that plan, which we'll be putting together for our team at the end of this month. Now, what's really important for us when we put this together is we've got a few things that the plan is about. So the plan is about making sure we achieve our body condition score targets. So we want to make sure that our first and second calvers are calving at a body condition score of 5.5 and that our mixed stage cows are at a 5. Now, we also want to make sure we achieve our average pasture cover targets. So for us, that's 1st of June, 2,400 kilograms of dry matter per hectare, average pasture cover. And we need to make sure we've got reserves of feed on hand. At this stage, it's looking like about 100 kilograms per cow of forage plus palm kernel. So we made the decision early on in the summer to use some of our stored forage, and the idea was that we were going to use palm kernel to replace it. But we've got to the point now where we can't survive a spring feeding all palm kernel, and we need to make sure we've got some forage there that we can feed out to the cows during that time. So the basis of the plan is that we have a feed inventory. So every week we are literally walking out the stack, wondering where it's all disappeared to. We are counting bales, we are checking how much feed we've got left on contracts and what feed is still available. So that's one part of it. The second part of it is the milking frequency strategy. Tom's already talked about how we've used milking frequency as a mechanism to primarily preserve body condition score, but we are now using milking frequency as a way to reduce demand. So one of the big options with being able to dry cows off is it reduces the demand, particularly on pasture. And for us, the big priority is to have pasture growth rates at least 10 kilos over and above what our demand on pasture is at the moment. And we need to maintain that through to the end of the season in order to build our covers. So the milking frequency is one mechanism at which we can help to alleviate some of that pressure on demand. Not so much when we go from twice a day to 3 and 2, because that doesn't change demand at all. A little bit when we go once a day, but definitely when we start to dry those cows off. They go from 14 kilos down to about an 8 kilo intake. So the cull strategy is a really important part of being able to reduce demand as well. It's been pretty tricky getting cows off farm, hasn't it, Tom?
Yep.
And as Tom mentioned, we've still got a few to get rid of. What's the normal plan though? Like, we wouldn't normally hold cows, empty cows on farm this late, would we, Tom?
No, definitely not. Usually, we know we've got some definite culls before we do our second scanning early February, and then we would have a good group to go after we've scanned, usually at the end of that first week of February. Even though we've had them booked in, obviously with the current situation, it's been just tough getting them away. But we've got them away in reasonable mobs. The last mob of 20 cows. That was really helpful in reducing that demand on silage.
Okay, so this person's pretty important to us. This is Peter from Cambridge Vets. He does our individual body condition score for our cows. We're getting them done almost monthly at the moment because that information is vital for us when we're choosing which cows we need to dry off. The reason this information is really important is we use InfoVet to track body condition scores of individual cows, and we are able to align that with their age and therefore their calving target, and we align it with their calving date. So we can then create a group of early mature cows and late mature cows, as well as rising 3-year-olds. We use this information in conjunction with the DairyNZ body condition score dry-off date calculator. And what it is able to produce is a target dry-off strategy for us. And you can tailor that dry-off strategy based on the level of weight gain. For our farm, it's realistic to expect half a body condition score a month of gain. That requires those cows to be getting about 2 to 3 kilos over and above maintenance. Now, for us, the way that we have got the separation with the milking and dry cows, the milking cows are fed maintenance. They're not fed to gain weight. Therefore, any cow that is in milk at the moment must exceed the body condition score threshold in order to stay in that herd. Cows that are dried off, we are feeding to gain weight for those girls. So one of the tables that we use, we've got when is the latest time to dry off to meet these targets, and as Tom mentioned before, at our last body condition score we only had 16 cows that body condition score triggered their dry off. The rest of the remaining group we dried off before body condition score was limiting because we needed to be able to reduce the demand on pasture. how this looks is that pretty much through April, we can keep half of the herd in milk based on body condition score alone, if we are able to still achieve our pasture cover target and to keep our feed reserves on farm by the 1st of June. So one of the big other tools that we use when we're doing this is feed budgeting. The program that we use is FarmX. Some of you may use Dairy NZ's feed budgeting templates that are available on their website. When we got to the end of February and we knew we had 2 weeks worth of crop left, Tom and I put a proposal together to the wider group in order to bring in an extra 50 tonne of feed. So at the time we thought 20k, we'll buy an extra 50 tonne of feed. The option was to dry off the herd and achieve about 153,000 kilos of milk solids, or to bring in the extra feed, milk a core group of cows where body condition score wasn't limiting through to the end of April and achieve 164,000 kilograms of milk solid. So kind of what actually happened is we went out to the market with our money, didn't we, Tom?
Yep. So that 20,000 would have got us about 50 tonne of maize. You know, when we took that idea to the committee, such a small stack, there would have been a lot of wastage, which obviously would have pushed up the value of the kilo actually down the throat. So we looked for some grass silage. We ended up paying sort of 55 to 65 cents a kilo, but the utilisation of those bales is going to obviously be better than that of maize. Plus the building cows up on a maize diet for such a small amount, it's a little bit more tricky.
So as you're aware of with our balanced scorecard approach, every decision we make is not purely built on profit. We have to think about some of the feed characteristics, the practicalities given the resources that we've got. What's the impact on the animals? Are there any nutritional challenges with it? How does it complement the rest of their diet? What will it mean for the people on the farm? You know, if we're having to feed 2.5 tonne of silage and we do it via bales, that's 13 bales a day. How do we actually have the time to actually do that? What's going to be the impact on production? Profit, of course, is one part of it, and then also demonstration. So as a working demonstration farm, we do like to try and keep cows in milk so we can demonstrate that to the students. So that was also part of our decision-making process. So kind of where we've got to at this stage really is our main priority, as I said before, is to only keep those cows in milk that we can afford to feed in April on about 10 kilos of grass. So the idea is that by the time we get to April, we want milkers to be getting 10 kilos of grass and the dry cows 5 kilos. And on top of that, they will also receive some palm kernel and some silage to make up a milking cow diet of 14 to 15 kilos and a dry cow diet between 8 and 10 kilos. That means that we can maintain our demand during April of around 20. Our long-term average growth rate during April is about 30 to 35. So we need to make sure that our demand is always going to stay under 10 kilos under what we're able to grow. So that means that for March, we are still having to make sure that our milkers are getting about 5 kilos and our dry cows 2 kilos. So that's pasture only. On top of that, they're getting their silage and their palm kernel. That means at the moment our demand on pasture alone is 10 kilos and we're hitting about 18 to 19 kilos growth rate at the moment. So unless growth rate increases in April, we don't have enough feed to be able to keep milking the remaining milking cows through given the amount of supplements that we've still got on hand. Okay, so that's about dealing with the end of this season. We've been really busy focusing on what production's going to look like next season. It's really, really important part of our strategy, isn't it, Tom?
Yep.
So one of the things that we are able to do is we're able to look at the individual pasture yield of every single paddock that we've got on farm. Can you tell us a little bit about how do you use this data to develop a strategy on which paddocks need regrassing and why, and what our farm is going to has done already for regrassing this season?
So as you look at the graph here on the right-hand side, the yellow and blues, those have been the paddocks that have been put into annual last autumn, grazed through the winter and then cropped through the summer. So obviously performed really well over the last 12 months. And obviously, down the left end, those are the lower performing paddocks. We really want to target those for cropping next year to try and get a better growing species in those paddocks. Some of those paddocks aren't suitable for cropping, either contour-wise, or they are going to be subdivided for housing in the coming years. So we don't really want to throw too much money at them. We're more likely to spend some money, in the form of undersowing some Italian, shorter lasting varieties of grass, just to boost up the production while we still have those paddocks. We've done about 47 hectares of the farm. All the seed's now in the ground. Most of the regrassing or undersowing was done with DAP down the spout at varying rates. I haven't this year used annuals ahead of all of my crop paddocks because, as I said before when we were talking about crops, we were targeting some slightly wetter paddocks. Those paddocks through winter and early spring, if we do get rain, they're quite wet. So, yeah, we want to be able to utilise the feed that we are growing. Not be having to walk past these long annual paddocks and not be able to graze them. The farmers, would really push in this homegrown feed, so we've got to spend the money at home in regenerating pastures. Two hard summers in a row has put a lot of pressure on these paddocks. Really enjoying how well the Coxfoot rye mixes have performed over the last 2 seasons. And as you saw yesterday on the post, the Coxfoot paddock's doing really well. That was probably a bit green or a bit longer and greener than the rest of the Coxfoots because it had it's had 47 mils of rain along with the rest of the farm, but it also had an application of effluent, so it's really boosting out of the ground. But yeah, the Coxfoot on our dry areas of the farm is really performing well. So we've got a targeted approach of how we regrass every autumn. Obviously, we're sowing permanent pastures, perennial pastures into our crop paddocks. As I said, we use annuals ahead of our crop to boost growth through the winter period in our poorer performing paddocks. But we want to utilise that feed. And then just to fill the gap, maybe 2 years ahead of going into crop, we'll undersow with some Italians and sort of mid-range or middle of the graph performing paddocks, we will just undersow some perennial seed there just to keep them going.
So Tom, getting the new pastures back on track has been a real priority. It's come at a bit of a cost in relation to the feed that was on farm, and how did you prepare for that? So cows went into paddocks, grazed out paddocks ready for sowing. Did you plan ahead to know that you were going to be potentially on a quicker round for a little while and you needed extra supplements, but this was still a priority?
We knew that Greg was going to be here. The seed was on farm, so was the fertiliser. So we wanted to be ready when the drill was ready. So we offered a slightly larger area. I think we were down to mid-40 day round 2 weeks ago when Greg came the first time. But we actually pulled back on the silage and the palm kernel to allow for that extra pasture offered. So that may have offered us an extra 3 days of silage. In a week or two's time. Every day if they get a little bit more grass, they get a little bit less of something else. So we're not over or underfeeding them.
So you went fast for a little while in order to be able to slow down now and allow time for those pastures to establish properly and to make sure we haven't got undue pressure on the rest of the paddocks that are regrowing and recovering from the dry period. Hope that answers your question, Frank. And the last thing is you've been busy putting on the fertiliser as well, and we've got a little bit of information from Sam McDougall, who's with Balance, about SurePhos. So this year we're putting on SurePhos as our phosphate fertiliser. As we mentioned earlier, this application was due to go on the spring, but we put it on the autumn instead. The SurePhos is a very similar product to dicalcic, but without the liming effect. And there's also a little bit of magnesium in there as well, so that can be quite beneficial in the autumn. It's very stabilised, and you actually used your Sustain N with the SurePhos when you applied it, didn't you, Tom?
Yeah.
Was that quite of value?
Definitely. Being a staff member down and spending a lot of time preparing for open days and groups coming through the farm. Lani's been under pressure feeding out, so having Whelan's come in and be able to mix the two products together has been a benefit. It was only a low rate of N at 11 units a hectare, but so it would have taken me a long time to go and spread that around the farm myself. So great use of the two products.
Thanks, Tom. And, just a reminder, in drought conditions, regardless of the length of the drought, that the soil only really stores enough nitrogen to supply the pasture for around 15 to 20 days. So, and the nitrogen and fertiliser takes about 15 to 20 days to be available to the plant. So our view was to put small amounts of nitrogen on in order to make sure nitrogen was not limiting with this regrowth that we've got. So applying that nitrogen fertiliser on or just after the first lot of rains with some reasonable confidence of follow-up rain, which we did assume in early March that we would get some more, allows up for that built-up nitrogen to be used, but then for a continued release of nitrogen available to sustain the regrowth of those new pastures again. So just a reminder too that if you are looking at doing total end soil testing or any soil testing, that dry conditions can vary the results, so it might pay to hold off doing any of that until we get back to sort of normal pasture moisture parameters on farm. So if you've got any more questions about shore phos, make sure you go see your balanced vet rep. We always ask them all the hard questions, great source of knowledge there. Great, so thank you for today. We just wanted to hopefully explain a little bit about how we're working in all areas towards our balanced scorecard approach. If you have got any further questions that we haven't dealt with, please feel free to come and contact Tom and I. Come and see us at the farm, give us a call and we'll endeavour to answer any of your questions, and hopefully the information can be found on the website as well. We are planning to have our next Farmer Focus Day on the 20th of May. By then, I guarantee you we will have cows dried off, but we will have some beautiful conditioned cows, and we will be on target to achieve our pasture cover targets and make sure the farm is set up well for the next season. So just really wanted to say thank you to Tom, thank you to Jair, and thank you to Bill for being our moral support here, and thank you to participants for watching and for the questions that you brought in. We hope you enjoyed today, and we look forward to catching up with you again later. Bye.